I will start this video by admitting that I do view the title I have chosen as controversial, at least in my own opinion. The entirety of Crassus's record as a military leader does not suggest he was a bad commander. In my video Spartacus, the Battle of Salaris River, I go through Crassus's earlier military achievements in much more detail. The biggest in his early career was his turn as an officer in charge of Sulla's right wing at the Battle of Colline Gate. On Sulla's orders, he led the decisive action on his wing, while Sulla on the left was pushed back by the enemy, his actions leading to the victory that day. His role in this battle gave him the laurels he needed to build his fortune in Rome. And then against Spartacus, he proved himself to be the man Rome needed at the desperate moment. He trapped and ground down the rebel armies until finally vanquishing the Thracian gladiator at Salaris River. For more of a detailed breakdown on this campaign, you should go check out my first ever video on this channel. However, what has defined my Bad Roman Commanders series so far has been looking at the greatest Roman military defeats and picking apart the performance of the men who were in charge, and therefore ultimately responsible. Today we are not looking at the Crassus that ended the Third Servile War. Today we are examining the older and significantly more inept Crassus that led thousands of Roman soldiers into the desert to die. This is the tragic end of one of the greatest names in Roman history, Marcus Licinius Crassus, and the Battle of Carrhae. As always, we start with the sources that are available. The major source that provides an in-depth account of the campaign in Parthia as a whole is found in Plutarch's work Parallel Lives, which is a series of biographies on famous Greeks and Romans. Plutarch was a Greek philosopher and biographer who wrote his works sometime around the end of the 1st century AD. This places his time of writing at about 150 years after the events of Carrhae. Though Greek by birth, Plutarch did become a Roman citizen during his lifetime. Most of the detail in this video will come from Plutarch's account. There is another source with decent colour that comes from Cassius Dio, who was another Roman of Greek origin, and it's from his book A Roman History. Cassius Dio came from Bithynia in Anatolia. The only issue with Cassius Dio was that he was writing a good century later than Plutarch, so is even more removed as a source. Another two well-known Roman sources that mention details on this battle include Appian, who was writing his Roman history in the mid-2nd century, similar to Cassius Dio, and also Arrhesius, who wrote his long book A History of Roman War with the Pagans, much later at the end of the 4th century. Nevertheless, they do show how the battle was remembered in Roman society, if only in passing with these two accounts. In 56 BC, Crassus had reached the end of his consulship. He and his fellow triumvirs, Pompey and Caesar, had agreed to give Pompey and Crassus the governance of Spain and Syria respectively. This was the normal state of affairs for outgoing consuls. It was somewhat opaque that Crassus' intention in Syria was to use this as a platform to invade Parthia. This was quite controversial, as there was no obvious justification for such action. He did, however, have the backing of Caesar in this endeavour, and also Pompey. As he tried to leave Rome for his governorship, a tribune of the plebs called Aetius tried to stop him. This tribune was prevented from halting Crassus by Pompey himself, and another tribune loyal to the triumvirs. However, as Crassus left the city, Aetius shouted curses at him, a thing the Romans took very seriously. This would begin the trend in Plutarch's account of bad omens being present throughout the Parthian campaign. And also another thing that we see is erratic behaviour from Crassus. At the time of his leaving Rome, he was 60 years of age. By Plutarch's account, he looked older than he was as well. It was surmised by some that he regretted not having gained the military victories that compared to his triumvir rivals Pompey and Caesar. And additionally, Cicero theorised he wanted to pass on a greater legacy and even greater riches to his son, Publius Crassus, who would be joining him in Parthia. Crassus was certainly eager to arrive, By Plutarch's account, his over-eagerness meant he lost ships in the crossing, as he did not wait for better weather. After arriving in Mesopotamia, he invaded the lands and began capturing cities. Most surrendered to him with the notable exception of one, a city called Zenodicia, which was ruled by a tyrant called Apollonius. After conquering this city, he allowed his men to acclaim him imperator. Plutarch writes that this was shameful, as this victory was far too trifling for such an honour. Following this, he returned to Antioch for winter, where his son Publius would meet him. His son had been fighting in Gaul with Caesar and had brought Gallic auxiliaries with him. Plutarch is critical of his decision to return to Quartus, contending instead that Crassus should have pressed into Babylon and Seleucia, cities who were historically hostile to Parthian rule. While the Romans were wintering in Antioch, the Parthian king Orodes II sent a message basically telling Crassus and co to bugger off, and he would forgive the incursion. At the same time, Roman garrisons who had been ousted from the captured cities returned with horror stories of the Parthian army. This, along with bad omens, caused morale to drop among the troops. One of Crassus' most senior officers was the future assassin of Julius Caesar, Gaius Cassius Longinus. He, along with a few other officers, advised that they should turn back upon hearing the Parthian king had mobilized against them. Crassus obviously did not take any heed of this. Sometime after the Parthian message, the king of Armenia, Artabaxes, arrived, offering Crassus passage through Armenia in order to invade Parthia. He also offered him 6,000 Armenian cavalry as well as part of the offer. Crassus, however, declined. His reasoning was that he couldn't abandon the troops he had left inside Mesopotamia. It is strange, though, that he turned down such a generous offer. Whether or not he could trust the Armenians, or whether he just wanted to keep the campaign spoils to himself, we can definitely speculate on. It shows at least a level of overconfidence in himself and his forces. So Crassus would cross the Euphrates again, and he set out for the cities that he had taken earlier. Plutarch records that the general sent by the Parthian king to meet him was called Serena. Serena was noted to have been equal to a king in wealth and standing. He was around 30 years of age by this time. In Crassus' camp, there was some disagreement. Cassius had advised they regroup in one of the captured cities. However, Crassus seemingly allowed an Arab chieftain to lead him and his army deep into the desert. This man was called Arimnes, and the sources consider him extremely deceitful and untrustworthy to the Romans. Yet he was believed, and the army found itself far from comfort in an unforgiving desert terrain. Serena had ridden out to meet Crassus at this time. Cassius Dio and Plutarch both record that the Roman scouts were confused as to how many Parthians there actually were. Serena had hidden his true numbers where possible. Upon hearing sight of the enemy, Crassus was apparently scared out of his wits and proceeded to rush his orders to his men. He first called for a standard line formation, infantry in the middle, cavalry on the flanks. This was designed to avoid being outflanked in open warfare. But as this was being sorted out, he changed his mind and ordered a square formation. They continued on like this, and while marching forward towards the enemy, they found an oasis. His officers suggested camping there for the night, but Publius, reportedly, convinced his father to press on. The Parthians met them, and as mentioned, the force was a lot smaller than expected. The Parthian cavalry first went for a probing charge and threw javelins at the Romans, but upon seeing the packed infantry in numbers, moved back. From there, they fired arrows into the packed Roman ranks from horseback. The Parthians could also shoot while fleeing, which meant the Roman infantry was unable to do anything about it. The Parthians also had brought camels with arrows on their back, with which to restock during the battle, so the Romans could not just sit there and wait out the storm of steel, as it was not going to end very quickly. Eventually, Crassus, fearing that he would be completely surrounded, ordered his son to break out with the cavalry and attack the Parthians that way. The cavalry and the infantry that followed Publius were allowed to progress for a while by the Parthians, but they were eventually trapped as the Parthians had hidden back some cavalry. They were surrounded, and the arrows again pinned down the infantry that had followed Publius. The young Crassus led a final charge, but the Parthian armoured cavalry intercepted them, and the Romans were not equipped to fight them. Publius retreated into his infantry, and the Parthians charged in again. At this point, Publius had a subordinate kill him in order to avoid capture. The Parthians cut the head off his body and massacred the rest of the men who had followed him. From here they rode on to where Crassus was still in wait. Now Crassus, to his credit, had rallied a little while watching his son chase off the enemy. He had moved his troops onto a hill, which helped them a little bit against the issue with the enemy archers. The first Crassus heard of the news was a messenger that had been sent back by Publius himself asking for help. He was at this point caught between wanting to refuse to save his own army, but also the love for his son. He eventually ordered the army to move forward, away from the hill. The Parthian detachment returned, and they waved the head of Publius on a spear before the Roman army. The sight of this shattered the resolve of the Roman infantry. Crassus, to his credit, tried to rally the men, and Plutarch commends his actions even in the face of his own son's death. But he could not rally the men fully, and the Parthian tactics continued to win the day. A small addition in the Cassius Dio account describes that the Romans were actually betrayed by one of their supposed Arab allies at this point. The Arones, which was a tribe based out of Edessa, had attacked their rear position. But not being able to completely destroy the army, the Parthians eventually retreated at nightfall, as they did not fight at nighttime. Crassus was incredibly unhelpful from that night onwards, and to be honest, his agency in the matters basically ends at this point. The army was facing oblivion either from the Parthians or the desert. Crassus's officers, in the form of Cassius and another man called Octavius, took charge and led the men back to Carrhae. The Parthians followed them, in the process destroying the Roman men who had been abandoned or had to split from the main group. Crassus and his men attempted to flee from Carrhae, but the Parthians caught up as they headed towards the Euphrates. Serena offered Crassus to come to terms. Crassus definitely didn't want to do this, but his soldiers borderline mutinied and forced him to go. The talks descended into violence, and Crassus was slain, along with several of his officers. Most of his men were captured, and some slipped away, all the way back to Antioch. Plutarch lists in total that 20,000 Roman soldiers died, and 10,000 were captured alive. Despite these catastrophic losses, Carrhae didn't end up costing the Romans much, beyond their men and lost pride. They did not cede any great amount of territory to the Parthians, who were mostly focused on retaking the cities and pushing the Romans out of their lands. Cassius was able to regroup at Antioch, and then drive back a small Parthian attempt at invasion. He comes out of this with a lot of credit as far as the sources go. From the sources, there is a sense that Crassus got what he deserved here. He set out to make an unjustified war fueled by selfish desires. And by the Cassius Dio account, famously the Parthians would pour molten gold down the throat of his dead body, a symbolic punishment because of his infamous thirst for wealth. All in all, he completely mishandled this campaign from a strategic perspective, not pressing early and aggressively when he should have, and leading his army deep into the desert on the words of local chieftains. He was then outplayed in real time by the Parthians, who played their hand almost perfectly throughout. And for the outcome, he witnessed his beloved son die, and then paid the ultimate price himself in miserable, almost farcical circumstances. Overall, there is a valid argument to be made that his life would be remembered among the Romans, predominantly by how it ended, and the disgrace of this campaign. They would, however, gain some revenge in the future. The future triumvir Mark Antony would wage his own war against the Parthians many years later, along with a celebrated Roman army officer called Ventidius. Unfittingly, this campaign would end with the death of the Parthian king's son, Pacorus. Some vengeance for the lost life of Publius Crassus. But that's a story for another time, perhaps. For now, thank you for listening to me ramble on, and farewell.